Welcome to our next lecture on the Great Depression as we continue our look at the Great Depression and its impact on American life in the 1930s. Today we will explore some of the New Deal programs that were designed to combat poverty, particularly in the South and in Appalachia during this era. And we will also analyze and examine the opposition to the New Deal and to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because by the mid-1930s, there were multiple individuals with large platforms who were extremely critical of FDR and the New Deal. So we will start things off by taking a look at the New Deal and poverty. And if you recall our previous lecture, we discussed the first New Deal and the impact of some of the federal relief programs, even some of those programs that were ultimately declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. They still had a significant impact on providing relief to the millions and millions of Americans who were desperate for financial and aid and employment in whatever fashion they could get it. Programs like the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, those were the two that were declared unconstitutional in later Supreme Court rulings, but they still impacted Americans across the country before they were ruled unconstitutional and had to be adjusted or scrapped altogether. We also talked about the Works Progress Administration and the various divisions within the Works Progress Administration that provided job programs, federal job programs and federal wages to Americans during this time period. In particular, the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Art Project, the Federal Music Project, all of which collectively provided employment opportunities for creative artists and writers at a time when they had few other options to ply their trade and earn money. And we also discussed the National Youth Administration and its impact on keeping students, particularly college students and students that were finishing high school and preparing for college, giving them job opportunities that would provide enough money that they could afford tuition when they began their college careers, or if they were already in college, they could afford the tuition to be able to return for the next school year and continue working towards their bachelor's degree. So those were some of the New Deal programs early that we discussed about, and before that, obviously, we discussed FDR's efforts to reform banking and restore public confidence in the banking and financial institutions of the country. So with that out of the way, let's discuss some of these other New Deal programs that were specifically aimed at the South. I mean, they were aimed at combating poverty writ large, but they were especially needed, I guess is probably the best way to say it, in the South, because the South's economic fortunes were somewhat dire even before the Great Depression began. The South lagged behind the other regions in the United States in most significant economic categories before the stock market crash in 1929. For example, the South had the lowest average per capita income of any region in the country at just $365 a year. In addition to that, farmers in the South made significantly less money for their crops than farmers in other regions of the country. We talked about the fact that many of the farmers in the South in the late 19th century, and this was still the case in the 20th century, were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, and thus they didn't own the land in which they planted crops and had to give a significant portion of the money that they earned from producing these crops to the landowners. And as such, that kept Southern farmers at a much lower annual income level than farmers, say, in the West Coast or in the Midwest and Great Plains states. Industrial workers in the South also made less money than their counterparts elsewhere in the United States. There were not a lot of labor unions active in the South during this time, and just the hourly wages were significantly lower for industrial workers in the South, also primarily because of the lack of unions, but also because the South as a whole was less industrialized than the Northeast and the Midwest, so there were fewer job opportunities for folks to work in factories. And most of the industrial workers in the South at this time were working in textile mills or cotton mills. That was all before the stock market crash in 1929. Then the crash occurred on Black Tuesday, and that sent the entire nation into a prolonged financial crisis. And that's, of course, several years later is when FDR wins the presidential election and begins to try to fix the financial crisis. We discussed the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It was designed to provide financial aid to farmers across the country by paying farmers to plow over their land in some cases and to not produce as many crops as they normally could or would in order to get the commodities market rising again in terms of prices and for individual crops. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act provided these federal funds to farmers to effectively pay them to produce a much smaller output. And they did that in the South as well. But as I mentioned, most of the farmers in the South during this time period were either sharecroppers or tenant farmers, and thus they did not own the land that they planted crops in and harvested crops in. As a result, the federal funds from the AAA went directly to the landowners in the South, and the landowners decided to pocket it and keep it for themselves rather than providing those payments to the actual tenant farmers and sharecroppers. The landowners felt that it was their land and thus it should be their money, and they would use that money to perhaps buy additional land or buy more mechanical equipment that would allow them to work their land without sharecroppers or tenant farmers, or by reducing the presence of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Those were the types of things that the landowners in the South that received the federal funds from the AAA, what they used those funds for. But the bottom line was that it failed to lift the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers out of the poverty that they were mired in, because they didn't get the money to enhance their financial standing in dire economic conditions in the region and across the country. So that was one attempt to sort of fix the poverty issue in the South. Another one that was far more effective, that was part of the New Deal, was the establishment of the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA as it's known. And the TVA was a federal organization created in the New Deal era that, simply put, transformed parts of the South, particularly significant parts of the rural South in Tennessee, in northwest Georgia, in northern Alabama, and in northeast Mississippi, because it provided electricity at inexpensive rates through hydroelectric dams. They constructed hydroelectric dams and used the electricity from there to provide electricity to rural communities, rural homes in this region that previously did not have electricity in the mid-1930s. And they were able to get electricity and get it at a government subsidized rate, a cheap, inexpensive rate. At the time, only about 10% of all households in rural America had electricity. So the TVA coming in and providing electricity for many of these rural homes and rural communities, that was really transformative. It sort of ushered in a new era of modern life, for lack of a better term, in the rural South. By the time it was all said and done, nearly 290,000 households in the South received electricity through the TVA program. But the TVA didn't just provide electricity at government subsidized rates. They did a number of other things in the region, including enhancing soil conservation and forestry, and opening up the rivers in the region for barge and boat transportation. But one of the other things they did, besides these sorts of landscaping and transportation improvements, was TVA representatives would offer classes and training in agriculture to Southerners in the area, just sort of kind of giving them a modern update, if you will, in instruction on how to effectively work and make money in an agriculture economy, or in jobs perhaps that went beyond agricultural jobs. TVA representatives were training Southerners to get better jobs or become more productive with in the agricultural field if they were already working in the agricultural field at that time. And the TVA a tremendous impact in the region. You can see in the image in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, that's the seal of the TVA, founded in 1933, right at the beginning of the first New Deal era. In addition to the Southeast in general, the region of Appalachia, which of course consists of several southern states, particularly Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, parts of Georgia, parts of Alabama, but also extends beyond the South into parts of Ohio and parts of Pennsylvania as well. But the New Deal was programs, or I should say FDR realized that, and his advisors realized that Appalachia, much like the Southeast, the rest of the Southeast, was also an impoverished region that needed as much federal help as they could provide in order to survive the Depression era financial crisis. And so the New Deal contained programs that were designed particularly to combat poverty in Appalachia. Many of these programs were under the umbrella of the Department of the Interior, or the Department of the Interior had the responsibility of administering these programs. There was a homestead program known as the Division of Subsistence Homesteads, or DSH, which provided impoverished families the chance to move back to the land, if you will, and provide for themselves by working the land. And there were more than 30 homestead programs under the DSH during this time, and quite a few of them included land in the Appalachian region. In addition to the DSH, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which we talked about in our most recent lecture prior to today, the CCC, the organization of young men between the ages of 18 and 25, who regularly did outdoor labor projects to improve communities across the country for federal wages. And the CCC conducted many projects throughout the Appalachian region. Most notably, they created the Blue Ridge Parkway, which, if you're familiar with it, it is an area in North Carolina and Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountain region. And if you drive through that area today, there's some signage and some places you can stop and get out and sort of tour that identify it as the Blue Ridge Parkway and part of the Department of the Interior. In addition to the Blue Ridge Parkway, other CCC projects in Appalachia included improvements to the Chattahoochee National Forest in terms of forestry and reforestation, and also various state parks in the Appalachian region as well. So these were all programs within the New Deal that were specifically designed to lift Appalachia as a region and its residents out of poverty, or to enhance the landscape, or somehow improve the region as a whole physically and economically during the Great Depression era. So now let's shift gears and take a look at the critics of FDR and FDR's New Deal programs. Initially, FDR's New Deal programs gained a lot of popularity across the country from both rank and file Americans as well as politicians and business leaders. But by the mid-1930s, there was some criticism that Roosevelt began to feel, partly because the Great Depression was still going on. Although his programs had had an impact, they hadn't conquered the Depression and the financial crisis once and for all by the mid-1930s. And also the nature of those programs and who Roosevelt aligned with drew the criticism of certain individuals. The most prominent political opponent of FDR and his New Deal programs was a man named Huey Long. And Huey Long was a Louisiana politician who basically was the most prominent politician to come out of the state of Louisiana at that time period. He had been elected governor of Louisiana in 1928, and he was elected to the U.S. Senate from Louisiana in 1930, although he didn't actually take office until 1932. So he basically arrived in Washington around the same time that Roosevelt did as the new president. And Long aligned himself with Roosevelt's New Deal programs initially, but gradually, and rather quickly, I guess I should say, departed from supporting FDR and the New Deal to opposing it. Long was a colorful character. He was nicknamed the Kingfish for the flamboyant rhetoric that he would use in speeches and public addresses, and also for the bold attire that he wore. He wore a lot of sort of pastel dress shirts and two-toned dress shoes and things of that nature that really made him stand out among his peers from a fashion standpoint during that time. But he, as I mentioned, had been governor of Louisiana in the late 1920s, and he has a very checkered history as Louisiana's governor, as he did a number of things that enhanced quality of life for Louisianans at the time. In particular, he really provided the capital necessary to really enhance Louisiana State University, LSU, in Baton Rouge. He also had a free textbook program that they were going to provide to the schools across Louisiana, free textbooks from state funds, and also he rebuilt the Louisiana State House into a large, rather ostentatious state capitol building. Long's critics noted that he frequently overstepped his own authority during his term as governor, and they argued that many of his initiatives were unconstitutional and authoritarian. But Long didn't really care. He continued to basically do as he pleased as the governor of Louisiana until he ran for president, ran for Senate, and won his U.S. Senate seat. He, in addition to the fact that the Depression was still a reality even after the first wave of New Deal programs had been initiated by FDR, Long also decided to become critical of Roosevelt because of his own political ambition. He had a strong desire to be president of the United States, and he felt that he could do that. In fact, when he was governor of Louisiana, he actually had the governor's mansion renovated so that it would look and feel more like the White House, because he said that he wanted to be comfortable when he got to the White House and lived and worked in the White House as president. He had very strong national political ambitions even after he had just arrived in the Senate in 1933. And Long's basic long-term plan was to run for president in 1936. He was a Democrat, as was FDR, so he was planning on waging a campaign as a third-party candidate. And even though he didn't harbor any illusions that he would win that election, he thought that if he ran as a third-party candidate in 1936, that he would siphon votes away from FDR, and as a result, the Republican nominee would win, and that he was banking on the fact that a Republican presidency would fail to adequately solve the New Deal, or solve the Great Depression before 1940, in which case he could run again as the Democratic nominee and perhaps win the presidency in the election of 1940. So that was sort of a look at the long-term political plan of Huey Long. But before all that happened, when he first started to criticize FDR, he came up with his own plan for ending the Great Depression. He called it the Share the Wealth Plan, and it was a radical plan that consisted of a wealth tax on America's richest families, confiscating their wealth and redistributing that wealth to the rest of the American citizens. It was sort of a wealth tax / wealth redistribution plan. He guaranteed, as part of the Share the Wealth Plan, that every American family would receive $5,000 and all workers would receive a guaranteed income of $2,500 a year. In addition, Long also promised that his plan would provide college tuition for each qualified student across the country, a reduction in hours for workers, bonuses for military veterans, and pensions for the elderly. This was a grandiose vision that Huey Long had, and he really didn't think or care too much about the particulars of how all of this would be financed beyond just taxing the wealthy Americans much more than they were presently being taxed under FDR's administration, because it just simply wasn't practical for a share the wealth type of plan with all of that money coming from federal coffers. It just wouldn't have worked from a financial standpoint. But Long didn't really seem to care much. He enthusiastically peddled his Share the Wealth plan in public speeches across the country. You can see there in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, that is Huey Long preparing to deliver a radio address. You can see the NBC microphone there. It was going to be one of his many national radio addresses. And Long was a persuasive guy. His Share the Wealth plan was fairly popular among ordinary Americans who were financially destitute at the time in most cases, so it sounded like a great deal to them. And Roosevelt's advisors believed through polling that and research that they had done that if Long did indeed run as a third-party candidate in the 1936 election, that he would likely receive somewhere between 4 and 5 million votes nationwide, which very well could have caused FDR to lose re-election to a Republican nominee. All of this never materialized because in the fall of 1935, when he was back in Louisiana trying to tend to political business in the state capitol, even though he was a U.S. Senator at the time, Long was walking the hallways of the state capitol with bodyguards, and he was assassinated by a man who was the son-in-law of a political opponent of Huey Long, and Long was basically planning to gerrymander this particular political opponent out of the state Senate seat that he held. And so his son-in-law approached Long and fired a shot that struck him in the abdomen, and he died a little over a day later in a Baton Rouge hospital in September of 1935. So the challenge that he had been planning against Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election never came to fruition due to his assassination in 1935. Another critic of FDR at this time was a man named Francis Townsend. Townsend basically believed that the Great Depression was too big of a challenge for Roosevelt, that Roosevelt's New Deal plans were not ending the Great Depression or giving any sort of semblance that the Great Depression would end anytime soon. And he was particularly concerned with the financial impact of the Depression on America's senior citizens, the elderly community. Townsend was a California doctor who saw some elderly California residents scavenging through dumpsters and garbage cans in Long Beach, and was alarmed at what he saw and thought to himself that nobody should spend their golden years without enough money to provide for themselves in terms of food and shelter and basic living needs. So he proposed a plan to aid the elderly population of America financially. And his plan, the Townsend plan, was to provide all Americans over the age of 60 with a monthly income of $200. Now, part of this plan involved requiring these individuals to retire from their jobs if they were still employed at the time. And if they were paid $200 a month, and they had to spend the money that they received from the government within a month of receiving it, so that his plan, he argued, would solve two problems at once. Number one, it would provide financial assistance desperately needed by America's elderly population, and secondly, by requiring them to spend the money that they received in a relatively quick time frame, he believed that would stimulate economic growth while also providing necessary financial assistance. Townsend proposed that his plan could be funded through a universal sales tax, but ultimately, much like Huey Long's Share the Wealth plan, Francis Townsend's plan for the elderly was simply impractical from an economic standpoint, as it would cost America over half of its revenue each year, of the revenue that it took in each year, in order to assist all of the individuals that were over the age of 60, which really only accounted for about 9% of the American population in the mid-1930s. So, and another reason why Townsend's program was impractical was the fact that there were no mechanisms in place to ensure that the recipients of his $200 a month stipend, if you will, would indeed spend that money and spend it quickly. You could require it, but there was very little that the government could do to ensure that they were going to spend it or spend all of it each month. Another critic of FDR during this time period was a Catholic priest from the Midwest, a man named Charles Coughlin. Coughlin was born in Canada and lived in Canada through his college years in Toronto, but eventually settled in suburban Detroit, where he served as Catholic priest of a small church. Like Huey Long, he had initially supported Roosevelt's New Deal, but also like Long, he switched gears pretty quickly and ultimately opposed the New Deal policies. And Father Coughlin was a tremendously popular orator of that era. He held rallies in which he gave speeches, and he also gave a weekly radio address that was carried nationwide, syndicated across the country, that brought in unbelievably large audiences. 30 million listeners a week, most weeks. Sometimes he could get even more than that. The church had to hire a staff to handle all of the mail that Coughlin received from people that listened to his radio shows. And he created an organization known as the National Union for Social Justice in order to promote his populist message to the ordinary American listeners that regularly tuned in to his radio addresses. Coughlin's big beef, if you will, with FDR was that FDR had gotten too cozy with big business and Wall Street and the bankers of Wall Street. And it's that this criticism started as just simply an attack on FDR being too aligned with corporate leaders, but Coughlin continued to attack FDR on this issue, and with each attack as the decade wore on, from 1935 onward, it seemed as though his criticism devolved from just a disagreement over financial policy into straight-up anti-Semitism. He did not really hide the fact that he felt that Jewish Americans controlled the banking industry and were responsible for the financial crisis that America was involved in the Great Depression, and that Jewish bankers were part of a global syndicate designed to control the world's banks and financial institutions, and that this was something to be fought and something that could not be allowed to happen under any circumstance. So you can see how that was clearly anti-Semitic, and he became more and more blatant with these specific bigoted criticisms the longer that he was on the air. He also embraced fascist regimes in other countries, such as Benito Mussolini's regime in Italy at the time. He was also a vocal anti-communist, denounced communism, did Coughlin. And Roosevelt was aware of Coughlin's influence and even spoke to reporters openly about how Coughlin was making things difficult for FDR to maintain popular support for his programs. Coughlin ultimately was told by his superiors in the Catholic Church to cease these radio commentaries by the early 1940s because they had clearly crossed the line of social justice, which is what Coughlin claimed was the overarching goal of his addresses, and had crossed into political speech that the Catholic Church nationally and from the Vatican was not comfortable with. And in addition, in 1942, with America fully invested in World War II at the time, Coghlan was ordered to cease publication of his magazine in which he shared his political views to a reading audience. So in effect, he was deplatformed in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and after that, he stayed at that same church in suburban Detroit and remained a priest working at that church from the early 1940s through 1966 when he retired. He died 2 days after his 88th birthday in 1979. So those are the voices of protest, the main individuals that publicly attacked, criticized, and challenged FDR and FDR's programs. The biggest political threat of them all came from Huey Long. But the one thing that all of these individuals had in common was that they had populist messages that they disseminated to the masses in terms of trying to garner support. They pitched ideas that if the public got behind them, such as the Share the Wealth Plan or the Townsend Plan, that were supposed to be cure-alls to a very complex financial crisis. But ultimately, these men were, some historians refer to these men as hucksters of their day, just people trying to gain fame and notoriety and political power by presenting a bad faith argument to the American public through radio addresses, through public speeches, through magazine and other literature that could be disseminated via the mail. The voices of protest, pretty intriguing individuals, even if you disagree with their political arguments, but it's sort of a fascinating chapter in American history, because on the one hand, FDR was gaining support from Americans who had been helped by his federal relief plans up to this point, but again, the fact that it was taking much longer than anticipated to fully recover from the Great Depression, and that many millions of Americans were still impoverished or financially destitute during this time period, created a window of opportunity for Huey Long, Francis Townsend, and Father Coghlan, and several lesser-known others to criticize Roosevelt and present their own ideas as to how to solve the riddle that was the Great Depression in America. So that wraps up today's lecture, and I will talk to you again on Wednesday.